Hello ladies and gentlemen. There's been some background noise of late about the videos for the FlexRadio series of transceivers relating to PowerSDR, in so much that the videos that are currently in existence seem to be a little bit out of date. So I thought perhaps it would be a good idea to try to bring us up to speed with PowerSDR on my Flex 5000, showing you how to set the radio up initially from cold, and then I'll probably do a second video which will focus on some of the features to do with tuning and filters and such like, which is something that's been particularly requested, I've noted of late. So to begin with then, the first thing we need to do after we've installed PowerSDR, and I'm pretty sure that you're capable of doing that, there'll be two icons on the desktop, hopefully. One will be PowerSDR 2.6.4, presumably the latest version you'll be using, and this icon here underneath my mouse, which is the driver. I can't leave it there because it will disappear off the screen. So the first thing we need to do is bring up the driver, and I think, because I haven't just reinstalled it, I've set it back to what I believe are the factory default settings when you first get it. So when you run the FlexRadio driver for the first time, this is what you're presented with. Now, if it is the first time you've used it, I would recommend leaving the sample rate at 96 kilohertz. Of course, this will be determined by which radio you have. If you have a Flex 1500, you will only have 48 available. If you have a Flex 3000, you will have both 48 and 96. If you have a Flex 5000 radio, then you will have both the above two, but also in addition 192 kilohertz. Now, I am using a Flex at 5000, but I'm going to leave it at 96 for the time being. Not obligatory, but you can put whatever you like here. So, oops, a daisy. Flex. Can't type for the life of me. Flex 5000 RX2, because that's what I have. Enter. Right, so it doesn't serve any practical purpose changing it, but it does look nice. So, this is the bus section of the driver. There is a WDM section of the driver, which we really don't want to bother ourselves with unless we're so directed by technical support. DPCs, now this is an interesting one. Of course, there are a number of operating systems out there now. PowerSDR only works on Windows, unfortunately. It doesn't work under any other operating system as far as I'm aware. I haven't as yet heard of anybody succeeding in running it with Wine in Linux. DPCs are the critical thing for PowerSDR and the FlexRadio, because if you get any large DPCs, they will interrupt the flow backwards and forwards from PowerSDR to the radio, which will cause stuttering noises, crackling noises, things like that. Most unpleasant. As you can see here, the last time it was monitoring, it showed that I had a DPC, a max DPC of 3,999, and it recommended that I use safe mode 2. And what I'll do is we'll go back to the bus again, and as you can see, we have operation mode here and a list of possible operation modes. Safe mode level 1 is a good one to start with if your computer isn't the fastest. My inclination is to leave this at 2048 buffer size. If you find that you have very bad latency, then you can investigate reducing this at a later stage. So if I clear the DPCs, bearing in mind, of course, I am currently also running a screen presentation program, recording all of this. So, of course, there's a little bit of extra strain on the system. That's all we need to do. with the FlexRadio driver. So from there we can quit. Now I have reset my PowerSDR to factory defaults, so what you will see next is exactly what you should be presented with when you start the radio. That's the PowerSDR 2.6.4 icon. When PowerSDR starts for the first time, it will start loading PowerSDR, but it will also retrieve calibration data from the EEPROM in the radio. That gives PowerSDR its baseline specifications. A little warning, which if you don't uncheck this box will appear every time you start the radio, most annoying. Okay, and my PowerSDR of course has appeared in a different monitor, so here we go. That will appear on your screen if all is well. Now you can resize the window. This is, if you like, for the RX2 the most condensed form that you can see PowerSDR. I think that if you don't have the second receiver, then you will be presented with this appearance, with the second receiver tucked away completely out of sight underneath. You can resize the window, which will adjust the spacing between the elements on the form. We've got our shiny PowerSDR up in front of us on the computer, and of course the first thing we're going to want to do is press the start button. That will initialize the receiver. Now of course at this point we could start playing with the receiver, but PowerSDR is in no small measure quite a complex beast, and like any modern transceiver there are lots and lots of settings available, which some of which are actually quite critical to the successful operation of the radio. So, as this video is aimed directly at setting up PowerSDR, that's where we will start. If you bring up the setup, the first page that greets you will be the initial PowerSDR hardware configuration, which gives you the serial numbers of the radio, the firmware version, etc. Also, you have the option of using an external reference should you have a 10 megs external reference. I do, so I'm going to enable that. What we'll then do is follow these tabs through and make sure that the settings are ideal for our operating practices. Options. Spur reduction is fairly important, especially on a busy band, and particularly if you like CW. The spur reduction affects the way in which PowerSDR, of software-defined radio, deals with the inevitable images that do arise out of the SDR technology. By checking spur reduction, it will reduce the number of unwanted spurs that appear on a busy band. If you don't check it, there'll be no adverse performance effects, but it will mean that you will see multiple images on the screen under certain circumstances. Disable split on mode change, disable split on band change. Again, personal preferences, but you know what it's like if you're in split and you change band or change mode to go and work another station and you're still in split. It's very inconvenient. Process priority. Again, this is down to the speed that your computer operates at. I would recommend leaving it at normal and only looking at the alternative settings if you are finding that PowerSDR is stuttering or not coping very well on your PC. Slower PCs, you may want to adjust this to a high level, but I do recommend leaving it at normal until you're absolutely certain that PowerSDR is not coping in its current form. Always on top, disable tooltips, snap, click tune. Now what happens is when you use the click tune feature, which I'll show in another video, which involves the mouse, you have at the top of the screen here a tuning step, and that is obviously adjustable to whatever size you want. and when you use the click tune, if you have snap enabled, it will snap to that nearest increment. You of course can also put something in here which will appear on the title bar of the application, which isn't visible in this video. Calibration, we do not want to play with that. Ideally, not ever. Filters, max filter width, and save the slider display changes. Well, max filter width, we can just simply leave it as it is. We can of course adjust the slider mode from linear to log, but we're kind of used to linear changes on sliders, but again, personal preference. RX2, should you have the second receiver in the Flex installed, which of course gives you a XXX receiver ultimately, because PowerSDR naturally can operate two receivers simultaneously in the same bandwidth that the radio is currently set at. I would ideally recommend all of these be checked in the normal circumstances to make sure that your RX2 is disconnected, because with RX2 fitted it's fully duplex, and it would be possible to actually transmit with the second receiver still active and still in receive. And of course, if it's connected to an alternative antenna source, then you could end up firing an awful lot of energy from the nearby alternative antenna straight into RX2. So unless you have got special circumstances to not use these features, I would recommend they remain checked. Onto the audio section. Now, of course, this is the critical bit. This 2048 buffer size is the 2048 buffer size we saw in the driver dialog earlier. And although there were higher values available in that dialog, those higher values don't exist here. This will predominantly affect the amount of time it takes PowerSDR to process what is going on before it gives it to you. And of course, you know, if you've got a slow computer, then it can actually take a fair old time. If you have a faster PC, then you can select lower values of these buffer sizes. But what it will happen ultimately is if you choose a buffer size that is too small, I have a particularly fast computer, if you choose a buffer size that is too small, then you may well end up with crackling. The smallest buffer size results in the lowest latency. So we'll put it back to 96, which is where it was before. Incidentally, if you experience any problems when you make changes with PowerSDR and the screen appears to lock up, that can normally be rectified quite simply by pressing the start button and then pressing start again. Most circumstances that will solve the problem. VAC 1. If you intend to operate Flex with any traditional sound card AFSK programs like Digital Master, PSK Deluxe, you know, all of those digital mode programs that are out there and available. Of course, with a conventional radio, you bring cables out of the radio to an interface, which then does the A to D conversion and sends the audio data into your PC from the interface. And of course, vice versa, that the data sent out from the PC to the interface and then into your radio. This doesn't happen with PowerSDR. There is no reason whatsoever to connect audio cables to the radio except for your speaker out itself and nothing else. Now, while I've been talking, the radio has been operational behind me, but as of yet there has been no audio coming from the radio, and this is because my a screen recording program is set up to take the audio from the same source that the sound card modes programs would also take. What we need is to use a third-party program called Virtual Audio Cable. It's not terribly expensive. Newcomers to Flex sometimes feel a bit aggrieved that it's not provided as part of the package, but anyway, if you want to operate digital modes, or if you wish to bring the audio out of the FlexRadio into your logging program so that you can record the QSO or anything like that, it's necessary to invest in VAC and install it. Once it's installed, of course, then you need to be able to enable it. There are several options depending upon what operating system you're using, what driver architecture you're using. So I'm going to use WDMKS. If you use MME, then that will also introduce further latency, which is of course undesirable when you're running sound card data modes. Now, this may seem counterintuitive, but I would recommend that once you've got virtual audio cable set up, and if you've got 2 receivers in the Flex, then you will want 4 cables. If you have just the single receiver in the Flex, then you will only need 2. And as I say, although counterintuitive, I would recommend that you put the first one input on virtual cable 2 and the output on virtual cable 1. The reason for that is when you go to set up your sound card program and you use the drop downs in your sound card program to select which sound card is going to use, it makes more sense to have your input as cable 1 and your output as cable 2 in your sound card program. And so by setting it here, which I've done incorrectly, I hasten to add, if you set it up here this way, then in all your sound card programs, because let's face it, there are quite a few of them about, and many of us use more than one these days, you can have the same arrangement for each. Again, personal preference, but I think that it helps with logic. The buffer size, this will also affect whether or not there are any stutters or crackles coming out to your sound card mode program. Unless you've got a serious problem with latency because of a slow PC, I suggest putting it on the highest setting. This is where I leave mine. On the lower settings, I do sometimes still find that I do get some stuttering, and this is on an extremely fast PC, an i7 3960. And the sample rate, this is one of those areas which can become quite confusing, because, and especially with SDR, people tend to get confused with the sample rate of PowerSDR, which is the rate at which it's sampling the baseband. In other words, it gives you 96 kilohertz of bandwidth, or 48 kilohertz of bandwidth, 192 kilohertz of bandwidth. In VAC, the sample rate, we are talking about the actual sound card sample rate. Nothing to do with the Flex, nothing to do with the Spectrum display, purely the sound card itself. Now, some sound card programs like to operate at 11025, some sound card programs operate at 8000. And although some sound card programs provide you other options of running the higher speeds, sampling rates, in reality they tend to resample. I would recommend leaving it at 48 kilohertz if you can, because then if there is any resampling done, especially down to 8000, then it's not going to be resampling it into an odd number. Alternatively, if you know that your sound card program samples at 11025, then it would make sense to have it set at 44.1 kilohertz, because again then it 11025 divides into that 4 times equally. That doesn't leave any oddses with the resampling, which can generate artifacts. So in my instance, 48, because most of my sound card programs tend to operate at 8 kilohertz. mono or stereo. That really depends on what you're trying to achieve. We'll leave it alone for the time being. Now, gain. This is quite a crucial one, because the RX gain, that will determine how loud the audio is coming out to your sound card program. Too high and you'll be overdriving your sound card program. Too low and it won't be getting enough audio. This is something that you will individually have to set up with your program and set it up so that the levels are as you would want them to be. Right, so we're set up and we're ready to rock and roll. Now, obviously when I make this video up, I will control the volume slightly, but if you've got any sound card programs which bounce out audio, you may want to mute them or turn them down. When I check this box in a moment, you will hear audio coming from my radio for the first time. And there we have it. So the radio is now set on 10 megs. It doesn't seem to be doing an awful lot. There's a little spike here at 10 megs. That is actually coming from my 10 megs frequency reference. You know, if I unplug it, there we go, it's unplugged, the 10 megs is gone. Just plugged it back in, that's my reference frequency output. Focus in on it very closely, you will see that the peak of that 10 megs is bang on the 10 megs line, which of course it should be, because the FlexRadio is taking its reference from my frequency reference. And if it wasn't there, I would be very worried. And there you saw me zoom in to the pan adapter for the first time. So, going back to our setups. So now we have sound coming out for our sound card programs. A little bit further down the line, you can actually output the I over Q to a VAC, and in fact it would be possible to run another SDR program like Simon Brown's SDR-radio, for example, and you can output the I over Q to that and implement further receivers from inside the current bandwidth of your radio, which is quite interesting, but something we're going to leave well alone. VAC2 is there for if you have a second receiver installed in the Flex, so we'll leave that well alone. Back to the gain. The TX gain, this one is particularly critical because it affects how much audio is coming from your sound card program into the Flex. Too little and you'll have no output, too much and you'll have lots of angry dancing amateurs all over the bands getting extremely irate with you because of your IMD. To begin with, I recommend pulling that down nice and low, starting our sound card program, putting it into TX dummy load, etc., and then adjusting our TX output until it is at a suitable level. And in fact, I will take a look at that in another video briefly, because I can show you how to set it up so that you have the maximum possible output but retain the minimum possible IMD from that output, and it is possible. So on to display, and as I warned you before, PowerSDR is a complex beast. There are an awful lot of things that you can do and a lot of things that you can change. The spectrum grid. This is the grid that you can see the squares and the lines behind, and I can adjust the maximum. So let's say that if we know that we're never going to get any signals that are stronger than minus 30 dBm, then we can set our max to minus 30. And our minimum, of course, if we know that our noise floor never exceeds minus 130, then you can set that there too. So in this particular instance, I'm going to leave these as the default. There we go. I should point out that at this point in time I don't have an antenna with nothing connected at the present time. The step is self-evident, of course, the steps between the intervals on the graph, and alignment again is self-evident. Refresh rate. Now here's a crucial one. If you've got a very, very slow computer, it may help you to reduce the refresh rate, because that will reduce the CPU load on the PC. Let me pop that up here for a second. Yeah, there we go. That'll do for a second. Not hiding anything. If you have a particularly fast computer, then you can increase the refresh rate, and of course you can go to ridiculous speed, but it is very interesting to actually see what's going on at that kind of speed. When you focus in close to a station like an SSB station, you can watch the internal dynamics of a person's voice, the way in which the harmonics peak and dip, etc. You can fill the pan adapter or leave it empty. Personal preference. Personally, I like it. A peak text, which is this stuff down here, which gives you where your current peak is at and the level that peak is at, and the difference in frequency from your dial frequency where the peak is at. So if I alter frequency to 10.0, we're now tuned into my reference, as you can see. And at this sample rate, going in close, it's very, very, very nearly on with the correct number of hertz. But of course, it's dynamically measuring this from moment to moment. So although one would expect that to read 10, as I say, this is a dynamic measurement from moment to moment, which also its accuracy changes according to the sample rate that the radio is set at. So there we go. Now we've zoomed back out to the full width of the pan adapter and back into settings. The peak time and CPU meter, the CPU meter is down here. You can adjust the speed at which the information is refreshed. The same with the phase mode, which is a different mode available from the drop down, where the Flex is capable of showing you a number of different criteria: spectrum of the pan adapter, scope, phase and phase 2, waterfall, and you can adjust the dynamics of the waterfall, of course. Histogram, which gives you a useful indication of the peak frequency and also the previous peak frequencies. Panifold, which is a combination, of course, the appearance that we identify with the normal SDR, with a spectrum display and a waterfall as well. Panoscope, I don't use this one personally, but it's all down to personal preference. And of course, you can run with it off. It does seem a bit of a shame, but if you're trying to run PowerSDR on a really small PC, or maybe even a netbook, then you can save some CPU cycles by switching the pan adapter off and just using the radio as you would a legacy radio, if you like, which has got a frequency and a signal meter, but it doesn't have any pan adapters. A little bit self-defeating, but as I say, if you've got a slow computer, then don't knock it. Back to our setups. Our multimeter. This is our multimeter up here, and it will allow us to look at various criteria: signal, average signal, the ADC, or of course it can be off. That would be entirely self-defeating because of course we normally operate centered around signals. When the radio is in transmit, you have a whole host of various things that can be monitored: forward, reverse PowerSDR, the microphone level, the EQ level, the leveler, gain, ALC, etc. and I'll cover those in another video back to setups. And so, as I say, the multimeter section allows you to adjust the averaging time of the refreshes of the information you see. And of course you can also show the decimal if you so desire. I rather like it personally, so I will leave that on. Okay, on to DSP. Out of the box, I think it's safe to say that the initial settings for the DSP noise reduction and automatic notch filter aren't entirely ideal. And so what I'm going to do now is give you a set of values which are a good starting point. These values are ones which you may well want to experiment with in order to obtain the best results to your ears. But we all need a good place to start. And so I'm going to provide numbers which will provide exactly that, a good starting point. So for taps in the noise reduction, we leave 40. The gain, we will make 30, and the delay, we will make 15. We'll leave the leak as it is at the moment. The automatic notch filter, we will start with 68. The gain we will put at 50, and the delay we will put to 25. The buffers, now this is critical. These buffers affect two things. They affect the amount of latency that the radio presents. Lower buffer equals less latency. Higher buffer equals more latency. But these buffer size values also affect the filter shape. If you want a loose filter, then you can choose a low buffer. That will give you a very low latency, but it will also give you a fairly wide skirt on your filters. I'm a bit of a perfectionist personally, and so I run all of mine at 4096. I have a fast PC. These values in fact present next to no latency whatsoever on a very fast PC, and of course running them at this level provides you with the best possible filter skirts, which of course is what you want. You want your SDR receiver to be able to work close in to other strong signals while keeping them out of your audio passband. And on the flip side, of course, is you want to be able to transmit and know that any spikes in the frequency of your voice are being clipped off at the filter width that you have set. And so the higher the buffer size, the tighter the filter, the steeper the slopes. And of course, if you've got a fast PC, I heartily recommend running them at the highest level possible. But again, this will come down to experimentation with you, your radio and your PC. The noise blankers, I recommend leaving them exactly where they're to. The window, I suggest you read the manual, because I could spend far too much time on that. Moving onwards, image rejection, we will leave the keyer. Now here we go, this is a critical bit. Connections, primary keyer, radio. If you have a key and you have it plugged into the radio, which of course is an entirely natural thing to do, then your primary connection wants to be the radio. If you run sound card programs which provide CW keys from the keyboard, etc., then you will want to provide your COM ports to that particular program so that the program can key the FlexRadio on your behalf. And we'll come to COM ports. In fact, I'm not sure if I've already covered them in another video to do with the Heroes Pre-selector, possibly. I'll have a think about that. break-in enabled? Well, if you're a CW operator, then yes, this is something that you will need to look at. Older versions of PowerSDR really didn't work terribly well for CW, but because of the latency issues that existed, people were finding that there was just too much latency to be able to use manually key the radio in CW. But in more recent versions of PowerSDR have moved on in leaps and bounds in the field of latency, and I suspect now you'll find, unless you are an ardent manual 40 word per minute user, I'm fairly certain that you should be able to get good use out of the FlexRadio with it in its current software iteration. It's much better than it used to be. Options, of course, whether it's going to be iambic, whether of course you want a side tone generated from the radio, the usual options to change with iambic keys, etc. And signal weighting, weight and ramp, I suggest you read the manual, because again this will affect the shape of your CW signal. AGC, now we're getting into an area which is really quite crucial for the Flex, because as an SDR, the Flex radio doesn't behave in the same way that a legacy radio behaves, and the effects of the AGC in inverted commas, because of course it's a very different animal in an SDR than it is in a conventional radio. The maximum gain, and this is recorded per band by the way, the maximum gain, that will determine how loud the signal is that you're listening to, but it will also affect the signal to noise ratio, and I'll cover that in another video to do with the filters and the tuning and the actual operation of the radio. The leveler, this is actually to do with the transmit side of the radio, and will introduce some further compression. It can be quite gentle, but it also, with up to 20 dB of gain, it can also introduce some fairly coarse compression as well. But the leveler helps to reduce the dynamic range of the your transmitted audio. I strongly recommend reading the manual about this, as these values will obviously have an effect on how your signal sounds to other people. I personally use a second receiver, a second radio and a dummy load to set up my transmit profiles, because there are a number of adjustments that need to be made in order to ensure optimum transmission with the lowest possible distortion. Which neatly takes us into the transmit tab, and here we have a list of profiles. Not a big list, I may hasten to add, but you can load and save and delete profiles to your heart's content. On the subject of the TX profiles, Flex Radio are not stingy, and if you check this little box over here on the right hand side, it will give you a list of already tested and set up versions of TX profiles suitable for certain microphones, like the FHM1, Yaesu, PR40 and the W2 or IHY outboard equipment, for example, PR781 and some equalization. And you can import these in, they will appear in your profile. And of course you can, if you so desire, delete ones that you don't want in order to leave you with just the list of profiles that you want. So for now we'll select the FHM1 hand mic. Would you like to save the current profile? In this particular instance, no, but you may well want to say yes. Right. The transmit profile rather subversively affects a whole host of other functions and values that are tucked away inside the menu system of the Flex, and we'll look at those in a moment. But as I say, We come back to the filter. From the filter high and low for the particular mode and profile that you have set. On PowerSDR there is a little checkbox here down in the transmit profile pane, which allows you to show the extent of your TX filter on your pan adapter display. So let's say you were setting up your audio, for example, and you wanted to make sure that your audio wasn't overshooting outside of your filter widths, etc. You can have your filter width displayed on the screen, but it's not obligatory. So, but it is extremely useful to have that information to hand, especially if you're working with a digital mode. The downward expander stroke noise gate. Now, as far as I know, this is unique to the Flex still at the moment, and is incredibly useful, especially if you have a noisy shack. A downward expander, basically what it does is a bit like a reverse compressor, in that when you're speaking, your speech operates at a particular voice level, and depending of course on what kind of speed you have the ALC settings at, in between your speech peaks or in gaps in between words, if you have this enabled, then you can set the threshold that requires in order for something to be heard louder, and when you are not speaking in the silence, it will attenuate the output from your microphone by this much %. If it's set to 100%, it is a noise gate, and there is no audio whatsoever coming from your microphone unless you speak. And of course, in order for there to be noise, your speech must exceed the threshold. If you use the function as a downward expander, what you can do is leave your threshold at the same position, but change the attenuation, and this makes your speech much more natural than having a full-on noise gate which just chops everything off. Sometimes it can make speech seem unrealistic in some ways, and by using the downward expander, it will improve the dynamics of the tone of your transmitted audio. It's well worth experimenting with, and most certainly using a second receiver or second radio to listen to the results and balancing these two values, because the number of unsolicited good audio reports that I get, I lose count. And in fact, only a few days ago I managed to get into the middle of an enormous pile-up, which I'd been working on for maybe half an hour because I wasn't running terribly high power and the antenna wasn't particularly good. I'd been on there for that inordinate amount of time, finally managed to get my call through and be heard, and for the first time in that entire session, the DX station gave me an unsolicited good audio report. It makes that much difference. Of course, it's only part of the equation, but it really does make an inordinate amount of difference, and is well worth spending a lot of time with in experimentation to get this balance right. You will benefit from it, believe me. The monitor function, this is if you want to hear your own audio coming back out of the radio of your speakers, in effect. That adjusts the volume, the initial volume if you like. You can of course, while you're transmitting, use the AF slider to adjust the output of your own audio. But of course, if your radio isn't your computer isn't a really fast one, then there may be a delay because of the latency that is inherent with SDR. Fast computer won't matter. Really slow computer, I certainly can't cope with talking and then hearing my own voice coming back to me delayed by 1 second. I just start slurring and mumbling, especially if I have headphones on. So it's not the nicest experience in the world. But if you do want to listen to your own audio before it actually goes out via RF, then that is the way that you can adjust the level of that. AM, carrier level. Now, if you're an AM fanatic, and many AM fanatics have discovered that the FlexRadio is probably about the best AM radio for both receive and transmit there is, because of the TX profiles and because of the ability to adjust the carrier level. Because of course, if you reduce your carrier level, say from 25% down to 20%, then your effective audio will appear louder without necessarily having to overdrive. It will appear louder in relation to the actual carrier level, and there is a benefit to tweaking this particular value. Again, if you're an AM fanatic, then this function will be extremely useful to you. I don't use AM, so it doesn't matter. The limit slew, as you can see, a little prompt has come up there to explain it, and it is designed to ramp up the output level when you initially key in AM. Rather than keying up at the full carrier level, it will ramp up the power quickly, not so slowly that you would actually physically notice it, but it ramps it up more slowly to prevent overshooting from linear amplifiers, etc. On to PA settings. We don't want to know. Okay, this is factory calibration stuff that, as you can see, you actually need a keyboard combination to access. And if I knew it, I wouldn't tell you what it was. Appearance. Now, when PowerSDR first came out, of course, it was a goddamn awful looking thing. Some argue that it hasn't necessarily moved on that far. But they have introduced a whole bunch of skins. And what we can do is adjust those skins. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm trying to put this somewhere where you get the feel for what the skins look like without blocking absolutely everything. Right, here we go. So we can adjust the skins, and I'll run through them quickly so that you can see them in case you don't currently have PowerSDR or FlexRadio. Default 2011, shiny plastic buttons, a bit like a ICOM 746. Default 2012, much more classy, much nicer appearance, my own personal favourite. Then there are a whole bunch of IK3 VIG skins which he produced for the Flex. Some of them are nice, some of them are not so nice, but it all comes down to personal preference, and what I like, you most probably won't like, and vice versa. But they are there, and they do allow you to adjust the appearance of your radio, which of course you can't do if you've got one of those enormous clunking great bits of kit with a VFO on the front and 1,000 knobs. You can't change the appearance of one of those unless you buy another one. But you can with FlexRadio. They don't make it easy, but it is in fact possible to go in and start altering the skins yourself. It's an involved process, one that I do not recommend for the faint of heart, but it is possible. So as you can see, there's no shortage of different appearances. So okay, where are we to now? Silver glass. I really personally dislike the reflection that is being put on the so-called glass, if you like. That really irritates the heck out of me. So we'll just look at the last couple of them quickly. I really don't even want to comment on that. May be good for people with sight impairment, this particular one, I think. It's very, very bold. So anyway, let's pop it back to something. There we go. We'll leave it on silver glass now. That's not an unpleasant appearance, is it? At least it's not for me anyway. And I really don't think I need to explain too much about this. The colours are all fairly self-evident. Whether you want small or big digits up here on your VFO, and the small colour if you wish to change the colour. The display, The main display, you can change the various dynamics. The main filter colour, for example, I'm not much too keen on having that grey, so we'll actually move it to something a little bit more toned down, if you like. It's still there, but it doesn't obscure the signal that you probably want to be looking at. Meter, you can change it from an edge meter to the traditional SDR type PowerSDR meter. I'm rather partial to the edge meter myself, and you can adjust the colours, of course, here as well. I don't need to explain any more about that. There are keyboard shortcuts which allow you to change some immediate functions very quickly, whether you want to change the megahertz, kilohertz, hertz, tens, hundreds of hertz. You can set these keyboard characters to your own content. Same with the band filter mode, you can add your own keyboard shortcuts to make change. And cat control. Now, our cat control. If we want to incorporate our frequencies, modes, etc. in our logging programs, we're going to want to connect our Flex to a cat. Preferably not one with tails and fur and paws. They don't like it very much. So what we want to do is select our baud rate of choice. In the latest version of PowerSDR, they've upped it from 57600, which it's been right from the very beginning, and they've provided us with a higher baud rate, which I requested an awful long time ago. And obviously your data parity, stop, etc. relevant for whichever your program so desires. So enabling the cat, I'm on COM10, COM20 ports. Enable, and there we go. My Flex is now connected to my logging program. Bring it down in miniature. Here we go. And if I change frequency, we see, there we go, I change frequency on the cat. There we go. Well, I think we all know pretty much how those particular things work, so we'll not pursue any further. PTT control. If you want to be able to use sound card modes with your Flex, you need to be able to key the radio up. And with a conventional radio, of course, you use a sound card interface of one kind or another to create a PTT interface. In PowerSDR, it's all done in virtual COM ports. My PTT is set on COM14, COM24 pair. So in this particular instance, I select COM24, and all of my sound card programs key using the RTS on COM14, the other pair to 24. So that gives me my PTT. If our logging program, computer cat programs, etc. don't know PowerSDR, most of them do now, but a few still don't, you can ID your radio as an alternative using the Kenwood protocols. This will get you out of a spot if you're in it. So far though, my experience is that I've been able to use PowerSDR in most instances, including with the recent WS-JTX, the JT9 mode. I'm able to select the cat in that and operate it still using PowerSDR, because there may be functions, facilities and cat commands available in PowerSDR that are not available in these other implementations. So it's preferable to keep it to PowerSDR if you can, especially if you have cat control, remote control, which you want to be able to control some of the much finer details of the radio's operating parameters. RTTY offset, I don't need to say anything about that. If you're a RTTY head, you know what RTTY offset is. And then finally, there is a tests form, and this I recommend leaving well alone until you've got used to your Flex, or alternatively you've read the appropriate section in your manual. And that concludes the PowerSDR setup mode. However, there are more things to be looked at, so we'll move swiftly onwards. Memory. We can program in an infinite number of memories to our radio. They can include all manner of information, including whether they're simplex, repeaters, CTCSS frequencies for the, maybe 10 meter repeaters, etc. The modes, the TX frequencies, offset frequencies, the filter widths, okay, even the AGC mode and the AGC level for each memory can be programmed. So when you click on a particular memory, let's say we want to go to JT 40 meters, double click on there. That transports us to the frequency, which has got a birdie on it. That's interesting. And there we have it. That is the memory control interface. You can add, copy, delete, select. There is a close after selection, so that if you double click a memory, it will dismiss the dialog, which is nice. Moving on. Wave. We can record either pre-processed or post-processed audio. Pre-processed, if you hit the record button, it will record the entire baseband. In other words, if you've got your pan adapter, your radio set to 192 kilohertz width, it will record the entire 192 kilohertz, which you can then later play back. So if we hit record there, then what we're doing is it's recording your entire 192 or 96 kilohertz width. And then you hit the stop button. You can then add and select the recording that you've just made. Where we're on 14076, so we can double click that. We can then hit the loop button if we want it to play indefinitely, and hit the play button, and then what you are now seeing is not what is on the radio now, but what you have just recorded. And of course you can record them, you can download these, you can send files to other Flex users, they can send files to you and you can play them, listen to them, adjust the filters, adjust the bandwidth, all of the Flex parameters that you can normally adjust when you're receiving. But you can't tune outside of the XXX bandwidth, 96, 48 or 190 kilohertz. That will be the limit of your ability to tune, of course. So we'll stop playing, we'll stop looping, and we'll dismiss. The TX gain, if you're recording post-processed audio, so you're recording only what is coming through the audio passband, you can adjust the TX gain so that your transmitted audio that's being recorded isn't too loud or isn't too quiet. Again, something that needs to be experimented with. Equalizer. Right, Flex have very kindly provided us with either a 3 or a 10 band graphic equalizer, one for receive and one for transmit. On the receive, you can set it up so that the audio coming in, if you're especially you're a rag chewer or a broadcast radio listener, you can do some wonderful things with the receive audio here. The facility to tweak it to perfection exists, and the audio from the Flex is wonderful. And the same with your transmit equalizer. I would not recommend adjusting this beyond flat unless you've got a second receiver so that you can listen very carefully to what you're doing to your transmit audio. But it is nonetheless a 10 band graphic equalizer with preamp adjustment, so you can if you were to adjust all of your graphic equalizers high, then you can pull the preamp down to compensate so that you don't exceed the ADC threshold, because of course you don't want to exceed 0 dB because that produces distortion. And if you get it all wrong, you can hit the reset button and it flattens everything. The transmit equalizer is saved with the TX profile. So if you change your TX profile, you will change the transmit equalizer. CWX. The radio must be in CW in order to use it. Okay, let's go into CW then. CWX, which has come outside of the frame. Here we go. Our built-in CW key. We can do keyboard CW. We can tap away to our heart's content on the keyboard and it will produce our CW at the appropriate speed as we so wish, including characters, sending for space, etc. Very good for a contest situation, whatever. Trying to hammer out a bunch of contacts really quickly. It's extremely useful. It saves having to plug the key in if you're adept at doing keyboard CW, which I am completely and totally a waster on. I cannot do it for love nor money. So I personally leave this one well alone, but it is there and is extremely useful. The parameters are self-explanatory. I don't believe I need to go into them. You just type in your characters here and then you hit the button or whatever, the function key, and it's sent. End of. I won't do it for a moment because I don't have an antenna connected and the drive level set at 50 watts. Yeah. So moving swiftly on, the mixer. This one catches an awful lot of people out. The microphone, this is the actual microphone gain itself. This is the master microphone gain and has got absolutely nothing to do with your microphone gain here, which is separate, and a microphone gain that is specific for setting up your profile. Mixer. And I'll do a setting up the flex for transmit in a different video because this will go on for far too long. Basically, this is the first one you adjust for microphone. The rest of them, there is a line-in RCA in the back. If you want to use line-in from, I don't know, an external voice keyer, perhaps your favourite hardware voice keyer. Balanced line-in, flex wire-in. These will adjust the levels for those, and you select each one according to your own desire. Output, internal speaker. That's only for the Flex 5000C, which of course is the big brother to the Flex 5000, which has got its own built-in speaker. That one is grayed out because I don't have an internal speaker. Power speaker out, yes, we can adjust that. That will adjust our master volume going out to our powered speakers. Without our powered speakers, we won't hear anything, unless of course we've got headphones plugged in to the headphone port. And you can adjust the headphone volume separately here, along with, if you wanted to connect an external hardware recorder, perhaps via the line out RCA, you can adjust the output there as well. You can also deselect them if you don't want output routed to those particular items. Antenna. Here we go. Now, our antenna. Let's get that put there. There are two modes in the antenna. If you're a newcomer to Flex, I recommend using simple. If you don't have receiver 2, this will be grayed out. Okay. Receiver 1, the main receiver. You can select no connection, or you can select any one of the 3 antenna ports on the back, or your separate RX in, okay, which I don't have connected. Currently, my antenna, because I use external outboard switching, my antenna is connected to antenna 2. So there we have it. And a nice switch mode power supply spur there to boot. It's not lovely. So that's our antenna connected. And of course, from something I was doing earlier on, because I moved from digital to upper sideband, the VAC got automatically switched off because of a setting in the main PowerSDR settings pane. So we'll give you some volume, so now you can hear what's going on in the background. AGC, good place to start is about 90. There's a little bit of Ritty for the Ritty heads. Right, anyway, we're not supposed to be tuning. We're supposed to be looking at, not that one, the antenna. So you can select which antenna. You can select which antenna you transmit to. Transmit. Normally, they're locked together. receiver and transmit antennas locked together. You can unlock them, and you can now receive on a different port on the back of the radio to the one you transmit on. Of course, care is required. I only use one antenna port on the Flex at the moment. These are kept locked together. There is an expert mode which will remember your antenna settings and your switch, your outboard switching for amplifiers, etc. It will remember per band, and you can set them up in advance per band. I briefly touched on the switch relay, of course. If you have transverters or amplifiers, etc., outboard switching, whatever, there are 3 ports on the back of the Flex 5000 which you can control, and obviously these are grayed out on the smaller radios, the 3000, the 1500. They're grayed out appropriately for the number of antenna ports that they have. Setting it up for the first time, I'm not using either of those. I'm only using TX1, the red port on the back, so that's what I'm going to have. You can also put up a delay, which will obviously produce a delay between the moment that the radio is keyed. I set that to 1000. We'll put the drive down to 0 for obvious reasons, and then hit the MOX button. And now we'll use the tune button. Then you can see, under normal circumstances, if I press MOX, it will go into transmit, or if I press the tune button, it will tune with a tone. I've added a 1000 millisecond delay, so I put the radio, when I hit the tune button, it keys, but I don't know if you saw that little flicker here on the signal meter. There is that 1000 millisecond delay before the radio itself goes into transmit, so it will key your amplifier ahead of your radio to prevent any overshoots, or to assist with overshoots or any issues that you may have with delays in switching. There we go. One more time. On, click. There we go. Okay, so back to the antenna. I don't use this function myself, and I don't use expert. ATU, well, it's self-evident. ATU will run up a small amount of power, and it will tune your radio, and you get the choice of selecting how close to a perfect match it will produce. So let's there we go, we've just tuned. Oh well, look at that, look. I'm on a long wire aerial, which happens to be not at all resonant on there, and it couldn't bring down the SWR. So we'll go for something a little bit less perfect. And there we have it. It's managed to bring it to a 1.5 SWR. Bypass the operating mode, semi-automatic, which requires you to press tune when you change bands. Fully automatic, and which will, it will make sure that your SWR isn't excessive when you key down. And finally, you can leave it enabled when you switch bands. Of course, when you do so, it will then automatically tune. There, as you see, I've changed bands, and the antenna matcher is looking for a match. Oh yes, it did, look. There we go. So that's what happens if your ATU stays enabled on band change. When you land on your new band, it will immediately go into transmit and tune. So I think that it would be easy to misuse that and cause a lot of grief to people, so I personally don't use that function. But if you're in a contest and you're trying to get from one place to another really quickly, then of course it's a handy function. Flex control. If you're one of the lucky people who have bought themselves a nice tuning knob for their Flex, then you can adjust the functions of the tuning knob. I won't go into them here. They're fairly self-evident. You simply select either basic or advanced, which has gone over here outside of the window, and it allows you to select different criteria according to knob turns, button presses, etc. Right, enhanced signal clarity. This is only of any interest if you have the second receiver. If you don't, it won't work. This enables you to synchronize the second receiver to your first receiver on frequency. You can then enable it, and if you have diversity antenna plugged in to the input of RX2, you can adjust the phase and magnitude of the incoming signal of RX2 and use it to either enhance a signal or to null out an unwanted signal. In order for that to work, the second receiver has to have the same signal you're hearing on your main receiver, and at least as strong, in order for that system to work properly. But it does work wonders, and I find this of particular use on top band, where I have a dedicated noise sense antenna, which allows me to get my noise floor on my long wire antenna down from S9 to about S3 to S4 by nulling out the unwanted noise. Extremely useful, but only works if you have the second receiver installed. Moving on, get help. That will invoke a browser, and it will take you to the assistance center of the there we go there, FlexRadio Assistance Center, where you can seek assistance or submit an enhancement request. Right, if you have a Hero's Pre-selector, and I don't mean the big daddy expensive one of the range which has got cat tracking. If you have the smaller tiny SCR, tiny Pre-selector, I forget the exact name, you can manually control it from here using the I think it's the flex wire port. Not entirely sure, I'm not wholly familiar with this, but you can manually control the tuning of the Pre-selector using this function here. Very nice addition, and of course you can also choose which antenna we're using. A very nice feature. One final function that I should draw your attention to, and it's quite useful, and that is the ability to restore your PowerSDR back to factory defaults, back to the condition that it was in before we started messing around with all these wonderful functions and features. If something goes horribly wrong, if your PowerSDR starts misbehaving really badly, one of the first things that FlexRadio support will do is direct you to restore it to factory defaults, to reset what they call resetting the database. If there is any corruption in the database which causes the radio to misbehave in some way, then by resetting to factory defaults, it will remove the unwanted behavior. Something else I would recommend is, once you have set up PowerSDR to your liking, export the database. Current PowerSDR is incomplete and cannot be exported. Recent reset to factory default database was detected. It does not yet contain a complete dataset. You must close PowerSDR and restart before exporting the database. Well, now I've been told, haven't I? Okay then. Well, let's do exactly what we've been told to do. We will close PowerSDR. We will now open PowerSDR. The splash screen is on another monitor. Sorry about that, I wasn't quick enough. And hey presto, we have our PowerSDR back again. And it's started up in exactly the same condition that we left it in when we shut it down. Export the database. Once you've got your PowerSDR the way you like it, I very strongly recommend that you find yourself a nice little backup directory somewhere on your computer and save it, because if something goes wrong with the database, it gets corrupted, Why would you want to restore it to factory defaults only to lose all of the effort that you have put in making changes to your DSP settings, to your transmit profiles? If you reset to the factory defaults, all that is lost. So I strongly recommend that once you have the radio set up the way you want it, and even in interim increments between first running it and getting it the way that you like, back up that database, because you can always then restore the radio to a previous state. You can name it whatever you like. You don't have to stick with the name that PowerSDR gives you. Make it something useful, make it something descriptive, so that you know what was going on in that particular version of the database. If something goes horribly wrong with PowerSDR, and it does happen from time to time, you've got backups that you can go back to with all of your wonderful settings in your transmit profiles, which the Flex's capability with transmit audio is so superb. You'll probably end up spending a fair bit of time tweaking it and getting it just right. You don't want to lose that. So please back up, export your database. And as long as your PowerSDR doesn't change versions, the previous one was 2.5.3, this is 2.6.4, you can't import a database from 2.5.3 into 2.6.4 because there may be important changes. There is a way around that. I won't explain about it now. It involves a third-party application from Ray at K9DUR. That's the only tip I will give you for the time being. And that concludes the setting up of the FlexRadio PowerSDR. And in another video, I will look at its operation. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that this will prove beneficial to somebody out there who's struggling with the enormous diversity of features that PowerSDR offers. 73s.